Beyond the Pleasure Principle by Sigmund Freud. Chapter 1. In psychoanalytic theory, we assume without further ado that the evolution of psychic processes is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. That is to say, we believe that these processes are invariably triggered by an unpleasurable tension, and then follow a path such that their ultimate outcome represents a diminution of this tension, and hence a propensity to avoid unpleasure or to generate pleasure. When, in our study of psychic processes, we look at them with specific reference to this manner in which they evolve, we introduce the economic perspective into our work. An account that pays due attention to this economic factor, as well as to the topical and dynamic aspects, seems to us to be the most complete kind that is presently conceivable, and to merit special distinction by use of the term meta-psychological. It is of no interest to us in any of this to investigate the extent to which, in postulating the pleasure principle, we have echoed or embraced any particular historically established philosophical system. We have arrived at such speculative assumptions simply as a result of our efforts to give a description and account of the facts that we observe on a daily basis in our field of study. Being original, or getting there first, do not figure among the aims laid down for psychoanalytic inquiry, and the impressions on which the postulation of this principle is based are so obvious that it is scarcely possible to overlook them. On the other hand, we would gladly acknowledge our gratitude to any philosophical or psychological theory capable of revealing to us the meaning of these sensations of pleasure and unpleasure that are so imperative for us. In this respect, unfortunately, nothing of any use is available to us. This is the darkest and most impenetrable area of the psyche, and whilst we cannot possibly avoid touching upon it, it seems to me that we do best to offer only the most tentative of suppositions on the subject. After much consideration, we are minded to posit a connection between pleasure, unpleasure, and the quantity of excitation present, yet not annexed in any way, within the psyche. A connection whereby unpleasure corresponds to an increase in that quantity and pleasure to a decrease. We are not thinking here in terms of a simple relationship between the strength of the sensations and the quantitative changes that we are linking them to. Least of all, in view of everything that psychophysiology has taught us, are we thinking in terms of a directly proportional relationship. The key determining factor, so far as the sensation is concerned, is probably the intensity of the decrease or increase over a particular period of time. Experimentation may well have a part to play here. We analysts would certainly be well advised not to venture any more deeply into these problems until such time as we can be guided by very specific observations. However, I cannot help but feel a certain excitement when we discover that such a penetrating scientist as G.T. Fechner advocated an interpretation of pleasure and unpleasure that accords in all essential respects with the one so forcefully suggested to us by our psychoanalytic work. Fechner's statement on the matter is contained in his brief study, Some Ideas on the Origin and Evolution of Organisms, of 1873, and reads as follows: Inasmuch as conscious impulses are always associated with pleasure or unpleasure, we may suppose that pleasure and unpleasure, too, are linked psychophysically to conditions of stability and instability. And this gives grounds for a hypothesis that I shall develop in more detail elsewhere, namely that every psychophysical motion that passes the threshold of consciousness involves pleasure to the degree that it moves beyond a certain point towards complete stability, and unpleasure to the degree that it moves beyond a certain point away from that stability, whilst between these 2 points, which may be defined as the qualitative thresholds of pleasure and unpleasure, there is a certain margin of aesthetic indifference. The facts that have caused us to believe in the dominion of the pleasure principle within the psyche also inform our assumption that one aspiration of the psychic apparatus is to keep the quantity of excitation present within it at the lowest possible level, or at least to keep it constant. The latter postulate is the same as the former, albeit expressed in different terms, for if the psychic apparatus is geared to minimizing the quantity of excitation, then anything tending to increase that quantity is bound to be experienced as counterfunctional and hence unpleasurable. The pleasure principle arose out of the constancy principle. In reality, however, the constancy principle was inferred from the same facts that compelled us to postulate the pleasure principle. We shall also discover on deeper consideration that the particular aspiration we attribute to the psychic apparatus is subsumable as a special case under Fechner's principle of the tendency to stability, to which he linked the sensations of pleasure and unpleasure. That being so, however, we have to acknowledge that it is strictly speaking incorrect to say that the pleasure principle has a dominion over the way in which psychic processes evolve. If this were the case, then the vast majority of our psychic processes would need to be accompanied by pleasure or lead to pleasure, whereas all common experience contradicts such a notion, such a conclusion. The true situation, therefore, can only be that the pleasure principle exists as a strong tendency within the psyche, but is opposed by certain other forces or circumstances, so that the final outcome cannot possibly always accord with the said tendency in favor of pleasure. Compare Fechner's remark in a similar context that the tendency to achieve a particular goal does not imply the actual achievement of that goal, and the goal may not be achievable at all except in approximate terms. If we now turn to the question as to which circumstances are capable of preventing the pleasure principle from being carried into effect, we find ourselves back on safe and familiar ground, and in seeking an answer, we are able to draw on a rich profusion of psychoanalytical experience. The primary example of the pleasure principle being thus inhibited is already familiar to us as a spontaneous and automatic process. We know that the pleasure principle belongs to a primary operational level of the psychic apparatus, and that so far as self-preservation is concerned, it is never anything but useless, indeed highly dangerous, given the challenges posed by the external world. Thanks to the influence of the ego's self-preservation drive, it is displaced by the reality principle, which, without abandoning the aim of ultimately achieving pleasure, nonetheless demands and procures the postponement of gratification, the rejection of sundry opportunities for such gratification, and the temporary toleration of unpleasure on the long and circuitous road to pleasure. This notwithstanding, the pleasure principle remains for a long period of time the vehicle of the much less educable sexual drives, and there are countless occasions, be it on the basis of these latter drives, be it within the ego itself, where the pleasure principle overwhelms the reality principle to the detriment of the entire organism. There is no doubt, however, that displacement of the pleasure principle by the reality principle can be held responsible for only a very few experiences of unpleasure, and for none whatever of the most intense ones. Another source of unpleasure, no less spontaneous and automatic, arises from the conflicts and divisions that occur within the psychic apparatus during the course of the ego's development to more highly composite forms of organization. Almost all the energy that fills the psychic apparatus stems from its innate drive impulses. But not all of these are granted access to the same phases of development. As things evolve, so there are numerous occasions where individual drives or elements of individual drives prove to be incompatible in their aims and demands with all those others that are capable of joining together to yield the all-embracing unity of the ego. They are therefore separated off from this unified whole through the process of repression. They are restricted to lower levels of psychic development, and for the time being at least cut off from any possibility of gratification. If they subsequently manage by circuitous means to fight their way to some form of direct or surrogate gratification, as so easily happens in the case of repressed sexual drives, this success, which otherwise would have offered an opportunity for pleasure, is experienced by the ego as unpleasure. Because of the earlier conflict with its outcome in repression, the pleasure principle is once again confuted, right at the very time when various other drives are busy giving effect to it by occasioning new pleasure. The details of the process whereby repression converts an opportunity for pleasure into a source of unpleasure are not yet clearly understood and cannot be described with any precision. But it is doubtless the case that all neurotic unpleasure is of this kind, that is to say, pleasure that cannot be experienced as such. The two sources of unpleasure identified here by no means account for the majority of our experiences of unpleasure, but of the remainder, one can say with some semblance of justification that their existence does not contradict the dominion of the pleasure principle. After all, most of the unpleasure that we feel is perceptual unpleasure, involving perception of the turbid pressure of ungratified inner drives, or perception of external things. This latter perception may be unpleasant in itself, or it may provoke unpleasurable expectations within the psychic apparatus, and hence be recognized by the latter as a danger. The reaction to these demands of the drives within and dangers posed from without, a reaction that manifests the proper activity of the psychic apparatus, may thus quite correctly be regarded as deriving from the pleasure principle or from its modifier, the reality principle. This being so, it might seem otiose to grant the existence of any further constraints upon the pleasure principle. Yet it is precisely an investigation of the psyche's response to external dangers that affords new material and raises new questions concerning the problem at issue here.